Actually, what's the root cause of all of these conflicts in the region between Israel and Hezbollah, between Israel and Iran? And it all comes down to Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. And as long as there's no resolution to that conflict, there doesn't seem, to my mind, to be a real way to resolve these other wider conflicts.
Nobody wants perpetual war. The Lebanese across the board want peace, but they question if peace is possible with a neighbor that continuously violates Lebanon's sovereignty. If this war ends and Israel has occupied parts of southern Lebanon, rather than Hezbollah feeling under pressure, that will actually energize Hezbollah.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. What's really going on in Lebanon? Less than 24 hours after Donald Trump announced a ceasefire with Iran, Israel launched a massive wave of airstrikes targeting Hezbollah, it said, across the country. Iran says Israel is violating the terms of the ceasefire, so could the peace talks set to be held tomorrow in Pakistan collapse before they've even started? And is this exactly what Israel wants? To discuss it, I'm joined from Beirut by the Lebanese journalist and author Rania Abouzeid, and here in London by our foreign correspondent Secunder Kermani, who has just returned from Lebanon. Rania, let's begin with you. I mean, what's the state of play in terms of attacks? You know, Trump had said he had asked Israel to cool it. Have they?
Not down south, no. They certainly have not cooled things down south, and nor has Hezbollah, I have to say. They have also re-engaged Israeli troops in Lebanon, as well as fired across the border into Israel proper.
Right, but there is supposed to now be a talks process in which the Lebanese government, not Hezbollah, will talk to the Israelis in Washington. What is the point of that?
Well, that's a question that many Lebanese are asking here as well. So it's a very divisive. Let's start with that. The issue of talking with Israel is very divisive. It breaks a huge taboo here in Lebanon to have direct talks with Israel. But more than that, it's also about the timing. So about a month ago, more than a month ago now, Lebanon's president broke that big taboo by suggesting direct talks with Israel, and he set down 4 conditions for those talks. The first was an immediate ceasefire, and the fourth condition was the direct talks. The Israelis rebuffed him repeatedly on, he repeated this overture several times, and he was rebuffed every time until yesterday, when Netanyahu all of a sudden agreed to this, to come to the negotiating table, which has many Lebanese wondering about the timing. I mean, this clearly sort of splits Lebanon off from whatever might happen tomorrow in Islamabad in terms of the wider ceasefire talks between the Iranians and the Americans. Now, the Lebanese government also wants to be split off from whatever happens in Islamabad. Yesterday, the Prime Minister Nawaf Salam made it very clear. He said that the Lebanese government will negotiate for the Lebanese state and nobody else. So he's also made that sort of division. I just came back from central Beirut in front of the Hilltop Grand Sarai, which is where the Prime Minister's office is, and there were protesters who were gathering to protest the idea of talks with Israel. So it's a very, very divisive issue. Lebanese fear that it's a ploy by some Lebanese fear that it's a ploy by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sort of continue the military offensive while these talks are going on, because the Israelis are saying, come to the table without a ceasefire. And the president said, no, we need a ceasefire. So it's unclear if these things will even happen. They're unpopular. And the question of the ceasefire is the sticking point.
Secunder, I don't like being cynical, but you have to be a little bit cynical around some of these announcements, don't you? I mean, how much
probably
is
helps,
how much do you think is the Lebanese-Israeli talks idea and acceptance about making sure that the Iranian-American talks in Pakistan can go ahead, do you think?
Well, look, I mean, you heard from Rania there that Israeli strikes very much continuing in the south of Lebanon, with Hezbollah fire as well, right across the border back to Israel as well. But I think it's it's a clear, noticeable shift in the scale and the intensity of those attacks. What we saw on Wednesday was huge, with those 100 strikes in 10 minutes, devastating, hundreds of people killed. What we're seeing now is more contained. Of course, terrible for those people who are still there in the south, but not on that kind of scale. And I think that it's quite clear in my mind that that's the result of increased American pressure on the Israelis, the Americans not wanting to give up the chance of some kind of resolution to this global crisis over what, by comparison, is a more localized conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. I also wonder whether for the Americans it may be somewhat useful for their negotiating position for there to be some continued Israeli fire at Hezbollah, because it then gives them something to offer the Iranians in the discussions. Because the other Iranian demands, keeping the possibility of uranium enrichment, for example, sanctions relief, a toll charge on the Straits of Hormuz, these are big demands that the Americans are going to want to push back on. For them, being able to pressure the Israelis into scaling back their attacks, scaling back their plans for an occupation of parts of southern Lebanon are I would imagine, easier concessions to make. And so perhaps allowing the attacks to continue on the part of the Israelis is part of America's negotiating position as well.
So in this rather complicated 3D chess, the Iranians have the pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, which they have maintained their stranglehold on going into the talks. They have not opened up the traffic, and the Americans have the ongoing military pressure in Lebanon coming from Israel.
It's a form of leverage, isn't it? And don't forget that Hezbollah, faced a lot of criticism, even initially from its own core constituency, Shia Muslims in the south of Lebanon at the very beginning, for entering this war with Israel. When I spoke to members of Hezbollah when I was in Lebanon, they were clear that they did so because the terms of the ceasefire that was negotiated in 2024 after the last round of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel never abided by those ceasefire terms, continued killing people, 500 Lebanese people killed in around 18 months. Israel, of course, also says that Hezbollah didn't abide by those terms and was rearming in the south. But they said that was their rationale. So I think Hezbollah felt and does feel under pressure to deliver for the Lebanese people, and certainly for its core supporters, some kind of sign that entering this war has given them some kind of benefit. If this war ends, if the ceasefire agreement ends with an Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, people will ask Hezbollah, what was the point? You must have gone into this only, not out of our interest, but only out of the interest of supporting the Iranians. And so I think Hezbollah feels under pressure to have some kind of deliverable to its supporters. And that means that the Iranians need to ensure that Hezbollah is taken care of as part of this ceasefire talks as well.
Rania, is it at all clear after not just this period of military action, but the killing of Nasrallah, the wholesale degrading of Hezbollah in the previous war, what they want their role to be in the future of Lebanon?
Well, so let's start with what is Hezbollah. It has a military wing, and it also has parliamentarians, it has cabinet ministers, it has social services, it runs hospitals, it has schools. So Hezbollah, big bracket, big umbrella, is a multifaceted organization. In terms of its military wing, who are these fighters? We know who these fighters are when we see the funerals, and the funerals are for men who are from South Lebanon, who are from the Bekaa, who are from Baalbek. So they are men who are fighting and dying in the towns, in their own towns and villages. And what they say they want is a stop, an end to Israeli threats, an end to Israeli violations of Lebanon's sovereignty. They say they want an end to Israeli occupation. And actually, if the Israelis, Secunder said, if this war ends and Israel has occupied parts of southern Lebanon, rather than Hezbollah feeling under pressure, that will actually energize Hezbollah, because it gives them, that is their reason for being. They emerged in 1982 after an Israeli invasion that went all the way up to Beirut, and then they fought the Israelis down south in that strip of territory that the Israelis occupied until 2000, when Hezbollah helped, through armed resistance, push them out. So if anything, it might re-energize Hezbollah's base, and not just Hezbollah's base, but beyond that. I mean, especially after Wednesday's attacks. Yes, many Lebanese blame Hezbollah for entering this war and the previous war. Many question its motives. It is, and it makes no secret of the fact that it is part of Iran's axis of resistance. It is perhaps the crown jewel in Iran's axis. So it's it has, engaged in armed conflicts in Syria and in Yemen, and it is sent and in Iraq as well against ISIS. So it has its own independent foreign policy. Now, Sheikh Naim Qassem, Hezbollah Secretary General, was supposed to give a speech today, but he ended up issuing a written statement where he said, I quote, he said, "The resistance will continue until the last breath." And he reiterated his demands that the Lebanese officials, quote, "stop making free concessions to Israel." And he sees talks as part of the free concessions, and he sees the disarmament of Hezbollah as a free concession. So after this war, depending on if the Israelis occupy parts of southern Lebanon, that will have an impact on Hezbollah. And also whatever the government does, if it pushes ahead with its plans to disarm the group, Hezbollah may counter by trying to bring down the government. So either way, it's going to be a very rocky road here in Lebanon.
No, precisely. I mean, if the point of these talks from Israel's point of view is to disarm Hezbollah. Now, if the Lebanese government engages on that topic because it too wants to take Lebanon out of this cycle of war, isn't the risk another civil war?
That is a fear. That's a real fear. And that is something there's pressure on the Lebanese army, which was disarming Hezbollah positions. It was finding, weapons, caches and things like that south of the Litani River, which at its deepest is about 30 kilometers from the Israeli border, because that was a condition of the ceasefire. And it said that it had done, it had cleared about 80% of the territory or 90% of the territory down there, but it couldn't get into the rest of it because Israeli forces continued to occupy a number of positions down south. So, the Lebanese army commander on March 2, when Hezbollah made the decision to reopen a front that, frankly, Israel never really closed, as Secunder said, it continued with its attacks. The first thing that the Lebanese government did was declare Hezbollah's military wing illegal. That was absolutely unprecedented. And it called on the Lebanese army commander to push forward with disarming the group. Now, he pushed back and he said, listen, it's not the time for it now. We're in another war. And he fears also what any confrontation between the Lebanese army and Hezbollah might do, because in the civil war, when the Lebanese army was tasked with taking on sectarian militias, it often splintered along sectarian lines. And the Lebanese army is just about the only national institution which is considered above the sectarian fray. And, it's considered a uniter, not a divider. And it is very highly respected. So challenging or threatening the cohesion of just about the one national institution that everybody respects is a very, very dangerous game to play.
I mean, I think, the kind of issues that Rania is talking about speak to the intractability of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel and Israeli politicians seem to be, certainly military officials, seem to be realizing now that it is not realistic for them to by force disarm Hezbollah. And that's why you've seen in language in recent days a rowing back. And so whilst the Israeli defense minister had been talking about occupying southern Lebanon right up to the Litani River, now military officials are briefing the Israeli press that the occupation would be around 4 or 5 kilometers deep. And that is something that I think is a recognition of the fact that it would not be feasible for them to hold such a vast swathe of territory, given that the majority of the population there is receptive to, supportive of, at least ideologically, to Hezbollah, and as Rania was saying, would be energized by the prospect of fighting against some kind of renewed Israeli occupation. So if Israel, with all its clear, overwhelming military superiority, does not think it's feasible to disarm Hezbollah by force, how can it expect a much weaker Lebanese state and Lebanese army to carry out that process of disarmament, given the kind of history of sectarian strife that we've seen in the past? And to my mind, it comes down to actually what's the root cause of all of these conflicts in the region between Israel and Hezbollah, between Israel and Iran, and it all comes down to Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. And as long as there's no resolution to that conflict, there doesn't seem, to my mind, to be a real way to resolve these other wider conflicts. And so then you have Israel carrying out its policy of what it has called in the past mowing the lawn. You know, a very offhand way of describing terrible attacks that cause huge numbers of civilian casualties, but that involve, from an Israeli perspective, setting back either Hezbollah or the Iranian regime by a certain number of years in their military prowess, and then after that number of years pass, then carrying out another set of strikes.
It's this perpetual cycle. It's absolutely the root cause, as Secunder points out. It is a Palestinian issue. It is, why did Israel invade in 82? Well, before that, actually, in 78, because there were Palestinian militants in the south of Lebanon that were fighting because they wanted to return to their lands. They were fighting for Palestine. And so this is, all of these things come back to Palestine. It's the same with, Syria, with all of Israel's main sort of problems with the region. If the Palestinian issue is resolved, then it is easier to resolve many other issues. I mean, let's go back to I'm here in Beirut. Back in, I think it was 24 years ago at an Arab summit, the Arab leaders came up with an Arab peace plan, and they offered Israel peace in exchange for it withdrawing from occupied Arab territories. And that deal has been on the table for like at least 24, maybe 25 years now. I think it was 2002, and that hasn't come to fruition. So that is the root issue, and it's the root cause. And the peace plan is on the table. I
mean, the trouble is that in a way, it doesn't really matter what kind of politician you talk to in Israel, that proposition is one they just will not accept. I did an interview with Naftali Bennett about three or 4 weeks ago, in which I said precisely this, the only way of actually breaking any kind of deadlock with Iran is to address the Palestinian issue. And he totally rejected it. He said this was totally false. The Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas were just, ideologically, religiously, innately wedded to the hatred and erasure of Israel, effectively, and that was the problem, and that it wouldn't matter if you created a Palestinian state, and that kind of approach is very widely felt, in Israel. So you end up with this situation with half the world saying, well, you've got to sort out the Palestinian problem, and Israel saying that wouldn't make a blind bit of difference.
You're right. When you speak to Israelis, they often describe Iran as the head of the snake, the root cause of all issues that and all troubles in the Middle East. Whereas, I think actually, if you look at it, the root cause is, as we've been discussing, the Israel-Palestine dispute. No doubt there are people in the Iranian regime, there are people in Hezbollah who want to erase Israel off the map, who do not believe in, for example, a two-state solution. But to my mind, it seems clear that if you want to have a regional peace, then a just solution with the Palestinians is essential because it at least undercuts the narrative from those other hardliners who don't want to see any kind of compromise as well. I mean, what struck me when I was in Lebanon is how many people there believe that Israel's attack, certainly, people who were from the south, for example, believe that Israel's attacks on southern Lebanon, on Hezbollah, are not about Hezbollah, are not about anything other than a greater Israel project. And that's fueled by comments by people like the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who is a settler himself and who, advocates for increasing, who would aspire to create settlements in Lebanese territory, in Syrian territory in the future, as well as in Gaza and, of course, in the West Bank. Now, in our trips to Israel, that doesn't seem to be the overriding public sentiment. The public sentiment there is, I think, something very different. It's certainly shifted dramatically to the right post-October the 7th, and it sees any kind of possibility of any threat as something that needs to be completely eliminated and stamped out at, no matter the consequences for civilians, no matter, I would say, really, for what international law says about some of those attacks.
I mean, are we all ending up in a position where we're saying there is no solution?
I spoke to a Hezbollah MP after 2024. I'd love to hear what Rania says about this. But, I said to him, it doesn't seem to me sustainable, the position of Hezbollah, that you start a war, as many people would say, or you enter a war with Israel, then, there's tremendous devastation that's inflicted on the Lebanese population. People rebuild. After 10, 15 years, the same thing happens again. And he's turned around to me and said, it's destiny. It's destiny. And so for him, it was inescapable and intractable.
Rania?
Look, nobody wants war. The people of the South don't like being displaced. The southern Lebanon is some of the most beautiful, some of the most verdant, some of the most important agricultural territory. The villages that are now being raised are older than Israel. There are olive trees down in the south. I mean, if an olive tree is a couple of 100 years old, it's considered young. Nobody wants to leave their homes. Nobody wants perpetual war. The Lebanese, across the board, regardless of what they think, want peace, but they question if peace is possible with a neighbor that continuously violates Lebanon's sovereignty. If we look at the period between 2006, which was when there was a major war with Israel, and 2023, when there was another war with Israel, those intervening years were relatively peaceful down south, and yet Israel continued to violate Lebanon's sovereignty with overflights, not just in the south, but also in Beirut. And there were thousands of these violations every year that the United Nations peacekeepers down south would clock and present in a report to the UN Security Council, and yet nothing happened. So it's a question of sovereignty. It's a question of, yes, the Israelis talk about how they want security, but are other states in the country allowed to defend them? In the region allowed to defend themselves too? Does Lebanon have the right to defend itself? Does Syria? Do Palestinians? This is an Israeli administration. Let's not forget Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, are wanted by the ICC for war crimes. Genocide scholars say that genocide has taken place in Gaza. Yesterday, I think, the Israeli government approved 34 new settlements in the West Bank, which is a violation of international law. So either international law applies to everybody, including Israel, and Israel's neighbors can live in peace, or unfortunately, it looks like this perpetual cycle of war will continue.
I think there is a bit of an attitude that is not necessarily spoken out loud, but is held nonetheless, which is that, well, Lebanon is a failed state anyway. It doesn't work. It can't get rid of Hezbollah. The power sharing that goes on in the parliament doesn't really work either. It's unable to have proper elections. Its banking system is a mess. So before this latest war, to what extent was Lebanon functioning?
Well, I mean, the same argument could be made of many other states in the region. Does Israel make sense? Do any of these states whose borders were arbitrarily drawn by a Frenchman and a British guy makes sense. But there, Lebanon has existed for thousands of years. So has Syria, so has Palestine, so have many other of the states of the Middle East. Certainly, Lebanon has its problems. And nobody knows that more than the Lebanese. There was, let's not forget, a massive protest movement in 2019 against the very politicians that drove Lebanon toward failed state status. It has its problems, it has its issues. The very agreement that ended the Lebanese civil war, the Ta'if agreement in 1990, has not been fully implemented. So, and that also pertains to the governing structure. There was supposed to be a Senate. There hasn't been a Senate. It was supposed to be a removal of sectarianism from the political system. That hasn't happened. So there are many things that Lebanon still needs to sort out, and nobody knows that better than the Lebanese.
I mean, it's interesting to me thinking about attitudes to Hezbollah, basically within the country. I mean, at the start of this war, as I said earlier, certainly you heard heavy criticism from Sunni and Christian communities of the decision to enter the war. And you initially heard criticism from within Hezbollah's core constituency as well. But in subsequent discussions I had with people who were displaced from the south, who were staying in the south, they said actually in the face of Israel's attacks, there was a rally around the flag effect. The prospect of an Israeli occupation was something that was uniting them back around support for Hezbollah. So it really just seems to me that, this Lebanese state has a problem and a difficulty with Hezbollah's presence, the state within a state that many see as it having created. It runs a TV channel and paramedic service. It's a political party. In the south, it provides a lot of the social services. It pays for the rent often, during conflicts that displaced peoples have to get to give out once they've been pushed out of their homes by Israeli evacuation orders. So the Lebanese state has a problem with Hezbollah. The Israeli state clearly has a problem with Hezbollah, but it's not going to go away. It's not going to disappear. Certainly not with Israeli military action. The fact that the Israelis were in southern Lebanon from 82 to 2000 and Hezbollah just grew within that period testifies to that.
I mean, hasn't there also been a sort of a slight turning on its head as a result of this Iran war, of the whole question of survival, victory, and who is on the up and who is on the down? After the killing of Nasrallah in the last war, there was a feeling, that Israel had effectively won. It had done massive damage to Hezbollah. After this war now with Iran, there is the opposite feeling in a lot of these places, where Iran feels that by surviving, it is the victor. Hezbollah must feel the same way. It is still standing. It is still able to send rockets over to Israel. It is still able to project threats to northern Israel. And that actually gives it a new lease of life.
Absolutely. I mean, same with Hamas in Gaza, for example. I mean, it is partly because all these organizations and regimes have a lower bar for what they term as victory, whereas the Israelis set out with these grandiose plans that we're going to occupy the entire south of Lebanon, we're going to completely eliminate Hamas, we're going to completely disarm Hezbollah, and then none of it ends up being possible, and hundreds, thousands of innocent people are killed along the way by the Israelis. And so, yes, I agree. I think this whole episode shows the limits of Israel and America's military prowess. That yes, they have air superiority. They can strike whoever, whatever they want. But it doesn't mean that they will get the outcome that they desire, that they anticipate.
And Rania, just finally, I mean, it's been seeming to me that with Iran and America, it seems impossible that they can actually reach a formal deal because their positions are so far apart. It's more likely they will end up basically just sort of stopping and saying, agreeing some sort of informal agreement over the Strait of Hormuz, but just kind of walking away and licking their wounds. Do you think that is also a likely outcome with regard to Lebanon and Israel, that it just kind of quietens down again until the next time it flares up?
You know, the truth is, Krishna, nobody knows because there are so many different moving parts at the moment with the idea of these talks between Lebanon and Israel, if they'll even go through. Naim Qassem, Hezbollah Secretary General, reiterated again today that the battlefield will do the talking as far as Hezbollah is concerned at the moment. So they're hoping to sort of secure battlefield gains, which will give them a stronger political hand in whatever comes next after this war inevitably, hopefully, ends sooner rather than later. So it also depends, like Secunder was saying, about how Israel initially said that they wanted to occupy up until the Litani. Now they're talking about 3 or 4 kilometers in, and Hezbollah is going to try and prevent even that. So it's too many moving parts, and it depends on what ends up happening, what the lay of the land is, and then we'll see. But surely, these are big, huge, intractable issues. The issue of Hezbollah's weapons. The state says they want to disarm. Hezbollah has said no way. They will not disarm as long as Israel continues to be a threat. Will Israel agree to stay on its side of the border and not even do the overflights that it was doing between 2006 and 2023? Will it respect Lebanon's sovereignty? Will it talks about how the Israelis in the north have to feel safe. Well, what about the Lebanese in the south? How are they going to feel safe? Are they allowed to feel safe too? So there are lots of different, really, really big issues, and it's going to take some time to sort through them domestically in Lebanon in terms of Hezbollah and its weapons, and also between Lebanon and Israel.
Rania, thank you very much indeed for your time. Secunder, thank you. That's the Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.